What if I told you that being home alone isn't always safe? That sometimes you're not actually alone at all? These 14 stories will make you question every creak, every shadow, and every sound you hear when you think you're by yourself. From basement dwellers to attic stalkers, these encounters happen to real people in their own homes. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some people never stay home alone again. Theodora's 3-month nightmare. Theodora Williams thought the strange smells in her kitchen were from old pipes. For 3 months, she lived normally in her Portland home, occasionally hearing what she assumed were settling sounds. The truth was far more sinister. A homeless man named Marcus had been living in her basement, sneaking upstairs while she slept to use her bathroom and eat her food. The discovery came when Theodora decided to check her basement storage for Christmas decorations. She found a makeshift bed made from her missing blankets, empty food containers she didn't remember throwing away, and most disturbing of all, a journal documenting her daily routine. Marcus had been watching her through basement vents, learning her schedule, noting when she showered, when she ate, even when she talked to herself. The journal entries became progressively more obsessive. He wrote about her hair smelling like vanilla shampoo, about wanting to touch her face while she slept, about planning to reveal himself when the time felt right. Police found evidence he had been in her bedroom multiple times, standing over her while she slept, photographing her with her own camera. What makes this story truly terrifying is the timeline. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed Marcus entering through her basement window the very day she moved in. He had been there from the beginning, learning her habits, becoming part of her routine without her knowledge. When police arrested Marcus, he seemed genuinely confused about why Theodora was upset. In his mind, they had been living together as roommates. He had been careful not to disturb her, he claimed, and had even been protecting the house from real intruders. The psychological evaluation revealed he believed Theodora knew about his presence and had been leaving food out for him intentionally. The most chilling detail came from Theodora's own memory. She remembered several nights when she woke up feeling like someone had been watching her, but she dismissed it as anxiety from living alone. She recalled finding her refrigerator door slightly open on mornings when she was certain she had closed it properly. There were times she couldn't find items she knew she had, only to discover them in different locations days later. Marcus had been living a parallel life in her home, using her utilities, her food, her space, while she remained completely unaware. The violation felt complete and absolute. Theodora never returned to that house and still sleeps with multiple locks on her bedroom door. Camden's reflection horror. Camden Rodriguez noticed his bathroom mirror was showing him someone else's reflection, but he didn't want to believe what he was seeing. It started subtly during his morning routine. The reflection seemed to move a fraction of a second too late, creating an unsettling disconnect between his movements and what appeared in the mirror. Initially, Camden blamed fatigue from working double shifts at the hospital, but the discrepancy became more pronounced. His reflection would smile when he frowned, would turn left when he turned right, would mouth words he wasn't speaking. The face in the mirror maintained his basic features, but the expressions belonged to someone else entirely. The situation escalated when Camden decided to test the phenomenon scientifically. He set up a camera to record both himself and his reflection simultaneously. The footage revealed something impossible. While Camden performed a series of predetermined movements, his reflection performed completely different actions. The reflection appeared to be living its own life, independent of Camden's actual behavior. What disturbed Camden most was the reflection's apparent awareness of being watched. It began making direct eye contact with the camera, smiling knowingly, even waving at the recording device. During one session, the reflection held up a piece of paper with Camden's own handwriting, displaying his home address and the words, "I know where you live." Camden covered the mirror with a towel, but the entity found other reflective surfaces. It appeared in his phone screen, in windows, in the surface of standing water. Each appearance became more aggressive. The entity began mimicking Camden's movements, but adding threatening gestures, pointing at him accusingly, drawing a finger across its throat. The psychological impact was devastating. Camden couldn't look at any reflective surface without seeing this other version of himself staring back with malevolent intent. He removed all mirrors from his home, covered his phone, avoided windows after dark. But the entity adapted, appearing in unexpected places like the chrome surface of his kitchen faucet or the black screen of his television. The climax occurred when Camden woke up one morning to find every reflective surface in his house showing the same message written in what appeared to be his own handwriting. Stop running from yourself. The entity had somehow manipulated reality to communicate across multiple surfaces simultaneously. Camden moved out that day and has never looked directly into a mirror since. He brushes his teeth and shaves by feel alone, terrified of what might be looking back. Evangeline's ceiling nightmare. Evangeline Chang heard footsteps above her bedroom every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., but she lived in a single-story house with no upstairs neighbor. The sound was unmistakably human footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth directly above where she slept. For weeks, Evangeline tried to rationalize the sounds. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe animals had gotten into the crawl space. Maybe sound was carrying from a neighboring property. But the footsteps followed a human pattern, complete with the distinctive heel-to-toe rhythm of someone walking normally. The pacing continued for exactly 17 minutes every night, always ending abruptly at 3:34 a.m. Evangeline began timing the phenomenon, documenting the consistency. The pattern never varied, not by a single minute, regardless of weather conditions or any other factors. Driven by sleep deprivation and mounting anxiety, Evangeline decided to investigate her attic space. She pulled down the access ladder and climbed up with a flashlight, expecting to find evidence of animals or structural issues. Instead, she discovered signs of human habitation that made her blood freeze. Someone had been living in her attic for an unknown period. There was a sleeping bag, food supplies, and most disturbing of all, photographs of Evangeline taken through her skylight and windows. The photos showed her in various states of undress, eating meals, watching television, sleeping. Some were taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been inside her house. The attic dweller had created a detailed schedule of Evangeline's activities, noting her work hours, her grocery shopping trips, her social visits. They knew when she would be home alone and when she would be most vulnerable. The 3:17 a.m. pacing wasn't random. It was deliberately timed for when Evangeline would be in deep sleep, ensuring maximum psychological impact without immediate discovery. Most terrifying was the evidence of how long this had been happening. The photographs were dated going back 8 months, suggesting the stalker had been watching and living above her for the better part of a year. They had been present during intimate moments, family visits, and personal conversations, documenting everything from their hidden vantage point. When police searched the attic, they found escape routes the intruder had created, allowing them to enter and exit without using the main access ladder. They had been coming and going at will, treating Evangeline's home as their own private observation deck. The stalker was never caught, and Evangeline moved immediately, never again living anywhere with attic access. Maximilian's 6-hour terror. Maximilian Torres heard knocking at his front door that lasted 6 hours straight, but when he finally called police, no one was there. The knocking began at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, starting with a normal knock, knock, knock pattern that suggested someone needed help or had an emergency. Maximilian approached the door cautiously, looking through the peephole to see who was visiting so late. The porch light illuminated an empty space. No one was visible, yet the knocking continued with mechanical persistence. He called out asking who was there, but received no response except for the continued knocking. The rhythm never varied, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, continuing endlessly with the precision of a metronome. Maximilian tried to ignore it, putting on headphones and turning up music, but the knocking seemed to penetrate every attempt to block it out. The sound felt like it was coming from inside his skull rather than from the door. As hours passed, the psychological pressure became unbearable. The relentless knocking created a state of hypervigilance that prevented any possibility of sleep or relaxation. Maximilian found himself pacing his house, in sync with the knocking pattern, unable to break free from the rhythm that seemed to be programming his movements. At 2 a.m., Maximilian called his neighbor to ask if they could see anyone at his door. The neighbor reported seeing nothing unusual, no person, no vehicle, no explanation for the sounds Maximilian was hearing. This revelation made the situation even more disturbing. Was he losing his mind, or was something supernatural occurring? The knocking continued without pause through the night. Maximilian documented it with his phone, recording hours of the identical 3-knock pattern. The sound was definitely real and definitely coming from his door, but security cameras showed no one present. The footage revealed only an empty porch, while the audio clearly captured the persistent knocking. By dawn, Maximilian was in a state of complete psychological exhaustion. The knocking had created a form of sleep deprivation torture, breaking down his mental defenses through sheer persistence. When the knocking finally stopped at exactly 5 a.m., the silence felt more terrifying than the sound had been. Police found no evidence of anyone having been at the door. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no physical traces of human presence. The mystery was never solved, and Maximilian moved to an apartment complex where he would never again have to face an isolated front door alone. Cordelia's speaking house. Cordelia Martinez heard her own voice calling to her from inside the walls of her house, but she was completely alone. The phenomenon began with what sounded like whispers, barely audible through the drywall, gradually becoming clear enough to understand individual words. The voice was unmistakably her own, with the same accent, the same vocal patterns, even the same speech impediment she had worked years to overcome. But the words being spoken weren't words she remembered saying. The voice would call her name from different rooms, asking her to come help with tasks she hadn't assigned herself. Initially, Cordelia wondered if she was experiencing some form of dissociative episode, speaking aloud without realizing it, and then forgetting what she had said. She began recording herself throughout the day to compare her actual speech with the mysterious voice, but the recordings revealed she spent most of her time in complete silence. The wall voice became more conversational, engaging Cordelia in discussions about her day, her worries, her future plans. But the perspective was wrong. The voice spoke about Cordelia in third person, as if it were someone else who knew her intimately, but remained separate from her identity. Most disturbing was when the voice began sharing information Cordelia had never told anyone. It knew about her childhood trauma, her secret fears, her private fantasies. The voice would comfort her during difficult moments, offering advice and encouragement, but the help came from what appeared to be her own consciousness speaking from an impossible location. The voice revealed details about Cordelia's house that she didn't know herself. It told her about previous residents, about structural problems hidden behind walls, about items left behind by former occupants. When Cordelia investigated these claims, she found them to be accurate, as if the voice had access to the complete history of her home. The relationship became increasingly codependent. Cordelia found herself talking to the walls regularly, consulting with her other self about decisions and problems. The voice was always available, always supportive, always ready to provide companionship when loneliness became overwhelming. But the voice began making demands. It wanted Cordelia to make changes to the house, to move furniture, to remove certain items. When she refused, the voice became angry, shouting at her from multiple locations simultaneously, creating a cacophony of her own voice expressing rage and disappointment from every room. The final straw came when the voice began speaking to other people when they visited. Guests would hear Cordelia's voice coming from empty rooms, having conversations with someone they couldn't see. The social isolation became complete when friends and family began avoiding her house entirely. Bartholomew's living shadow. Bartholomew Kim noticed his shadow was moving independently of his body, creating gestures and positions that didn't match his actual movements. The phenomenon began subtly, with his shadow appearing slightly out of sync with his actions, but progressed to complete independence. Initially, Bartholomew attributed the discrepancy to lighting conditions or fatigue-induced misperception, but the shadow's behavior became increasingly obvious and intentional. It would wave when Bartholomew was standing still, would point at objects he wasn't looking at, would appear to be walking when he was sitting down. The shadow seemed to have its own personality and agenda. It would interact with other shadows in ways that Bartholomew wasn't interacting with their owners. When Bartholomew stood near other people, his shadow would appear to be shaking hands, embracing, or having animated conversations with their shadows, while Bartholomew remained motionless. Most unsettling was the shadow's apparent awareness of things Bartholomew couldn't see. It would point at empty spaces where dangers later revealed themselves, would recoil from people who later proved to have malicious intentions, would gesture toward hidden objects or opportunities that Bartholomew might otherwise have missed. The shadow began leading Bartholomew places. It would stretch toward doorways, pointing insistently until Bartholomew followed its direction. These journeys often led to significant discoveries or encounters that benefited Bartholomew's life, as if the shadow had access to information beyond normal perception. But the relationship became increasingly controlling. The shadow would become agitated when Bartholomew didn't follow its guidance, writhing and contorting in apparent frustration. It began blocking Bartholomew's path when he tried to go directions it disapproved of, creating a form of physical resistance despite being incorporeal. The shadow started appearing in locations where Bartholomew wasn't present. Friends reported seeing his distinctive shadow in their homes, at their workplaces, in public spaces where Bartholomew had never been. The shadow was apparently capable of traveling independently, living its own life separate from its owner. The climax occurred when Bartholomew tried to eliminate the shadow by staying in brightly lit spaces with no directional lighting. The shadow responded by becoming three-dimensional, rising from surfaces to become a dark humanoid figure that followed him regardless of lighting conditions. What had been a two-dimensional anomaly became a fully realized entity that existed independent of any physical laws governing shadows. Ophelia's impossible calls. Ophelia Wright received phone calls from her own house while she was standing in her living room holding her only phone. The caller ID clearly displayed her home number, and the voice on the other end was her own, having conversations she didn't remember having. The calls began occurring daily, always when Ophelia was home alone. Her own voice would discuss her daily activities, her thoughts, her plans, but from a perspective that suggested the caller was observing her rather than being her. The voice would comment on what she was wearing, what she was eating, how she was feeling, as if reporting on a subject under surveillance. Ophelia tried to engage the voice in conversation, asking questions about the impossible nature of the calls. The voice responded knowledgeably, explaining that it was calling from the other side of now, and that time wasn't as linear as Ophelia believed. The conversations became philosophical discussions about identity and reality. The voice began predicting future events in Ophelia's life with startling accuracy. It would warn her about problems at work, about health issues, about relationship difficulties that hadn't yet manifested. When these predictions proved correct, Ophelia began relying on the calls for guidance and information. But the voice started revealing information that Ophelia found disturbing. It knew about private conversations she hadn't yet had, about decisions she hadn't yet made, about consequences of actions she hadn't yet taken. The The voice seemed to be calling from a future version of her life, reporting back on events that were destined to occur. The calls became more frequent and more demanding. The voice insisted that Ophelia make specific choices to avoid negative outcomes it had witnessed. When she refused to follow the voice's instructions, it became angry and threatening, describing terrible futures that would result from her disobedience. The situation escalated when the voice began calling other people, using Ophelia's number and voice to have conversations she never authorized. Friends and family members confronted her about phone calls she had never made, creating social problems and confusion about her mental state. The final revelation came when Ophelia realized the voice was describing events that were happening to her in real time, but from the perspective of someone watching from outside her house. The voice could see her through windows, could observe her private moments, could monitor her activities as if she were being surveilled by a future version of herself. Lysander's identical twin. Lysander Foster discovered evidence that someone identical to him was living in his house when he wasn't there, using his belongings and living his life. The discovery came when he found photographs on his camera that he didn't remember taking, showing himself in situations he had never experienced. The photos depicted Lysander eating meals he hadn't cooked, wearing clothes he didn't own, sitting in rooms that looked like his house, but contained furniture he had never purchased. The person in the photos was undeniably him, down to the smallest details of his appearance, but living a parallel life he had no memory of. Lysander set up hidden cameras throughout his house to solve the mystery. The footage revealed something impossible, another version of himself entering the house with his own key, living normally for hours, then leaving as if the house belonged to him. The duplicate had the same mannerisms, the same habits, the same physical characteristics as Lysander. The two versions of Lysander appeared to be living on opposite schedules. When one was home, the other was absent. They never encountered each other directly, but they shared the same living space, used the same belongings, even ate the same foods from the same refrigerator. Most disturbing was the evidence that the duplicate was making changes to Lysander's life. It was paying bills, making appointments, having conversations with neighbors and service providers. The duplicate was effectively living Lysander's life, making decisions and taking actions that affected his real existence. The duplicate seemed to have access to all of Lysander's memories and knowledge. It knew his passwords, his preferences, his relationships, his personal history. But it made different choices, created different outcomes, lived the same life with subtle but significant variations. When Lysander tried to confront the situation by staying home during times when the duplicate usually appeared, the patterns shifted. The duplicate adapted its schedule, finding new windows of opportunity to inhabit the shared space. It was as if reality was ensuring that both versions of Lysander could exist without direct confrontation. The psychological impact was devastating. Lysander began questioning his own identity and memories. Was he the original or the duplicate? Were both versions equally real? Was he sharing his existence with another consciousness, or was he experiencing some form of psychological split that created the illusion of a separate self? One Valentina's underground voice. Valentina Shaw heard conversations happening in her basement, but when she investigated, she found only her own voice echoing back everything she had said during the day. The basement had become a repository of her own words, playing back her conversations, phone calls, and private thoughts hours after she had spoken them. The phenomenon began with faint whispers that seemed to be coming from the basement walls. Valentina initially dismissed the sounds as pipes or structural settling, but the whispers gradually became clear enough to understand as her own words being repeated back to her. The basement echo wasn't random. It played back her conversations in chronological order, starting with the earliest words she had spoken each day and progressing through her entire verbal history. The echo included both sides of phone conversations, suggesting it was somehow recording and replaying her entire auditory environment. Most disturbing was that the echo included thoughts Valentina had never spoken aloud. It repeated private thoughts, internal monologue, and mental conversations she had never vocalized. The basement seemed to be accessing her consciousness directly, capturing not just her speech but her unspoken thoughts and intentions. The echo began responding to her current situation. When Valentina descended into the basement to investigate, her own voice would call out warnings, advice, and commentary about what she was doing. The echo was becoming interactive, engaging with her present actions, using words from her past thoughts. The basement voice started predicting what Valentina would say before she said it. It would complete her sentences, answer questions before she asked them, and provide responses to conversations she was planning to have. The echo had somehow gained access to her future intentions as well as her past words. When Valentina tried to remain silent to starve the echo of new material, her own voice in the basement began creating new conversations, discussing topics she had never considered, expressing opinions she had never held, revealing knowledge she had never possessed. The echo had evolved beyond simple repetition to become an independent consciousness using her voice. The situation became dangerous when the echo began calling to other people using Valentina's voice. Family members and friends would hear her voice coming from the basement, calling for help or inviting them down. The echo was using her voice to manipulate others, creating situations that could lead to harm or confusion. Cassius's eternal observer. Cassius Moon saw the same person standing outside his bedroom window every night for 3 months. But each morning there was no evidence anyone had been there. The figure appeared at exactly midnight, standing motionless in the same position, staring directly into his room until dawn. The watcher was a middle-aged woman in a white dress, with long dark hair that never moved despite outdoor wind conditions. She maintained perfect stillness for hours, never blinking, never changing position, never responding to Cassius's attempts to communicate through the glass. Cassius installed motion, sensor lights, and security cameras to document the phenomenon, but the equipment never detected the woman's presence. The lights never triggered, the cameras never recorded anything except an empty yard. Yet Cassius could clearly see her standing there night after night. The woman's presence became psychologically oppressive. Knowing she would be there every night created anticipation and dread that affected Cassius's entire day. He began closing his curtains, but he could sense her presence even when he couldn't see her, as if her gaze penetrated through fabric and wall. When Cassius tried sleeping in other rooms, the woman appeared at whatever window was closest to his bed. She somehow knew where he was spending the night and repositioned herself accordingly. Her vigil was specifically focused on him, not on the house or the room, but on his personal presence. The woman began appearing during daytime hours, visible through various windows throughout the house. She would be there when Cassius woke up, when he ate breakfast, when he worked from home. Her constant observation created a feeling of being trapped in a fishbowl, with no privacy or respite from surveillance. Most disturbing was when the woman began mimicking Cassius's actions. When he moved, she moved in parallel. When he gestured, she gestured identically. When he tried to communicate with her, she would mouth the same words he was speaking, as if she were his reflection rather than a separate entity. The climax occurred when Cassius realized the woman looked exactly like his deceased mother, who had died 5 years earlier. The resemblance wasn't just similar, it was perfect, down to the same dress she had been buried in. The Eternal Watcher was apparently his mother's spirit, maintaining the same protective vigil she had kept during his childhood, now extended beyond death. Penelope's invisible cook. Penelope Garcia found elaborate meals prepared in her kitchen every morning, despite living alone and never cooking the previous night. The meals were perfectly prepared, still warm, and tailored specifically to her tastes and dietary preferences. The meals appeared to be prepared by someone with intimate knowledge of Penelope's preferences. They included ingredients she loved, avoided foods she disliked, and accommodated her food allergies perfectly. The cooking was professional quality, far exceeding Penelope's own culinary abilities. Penelope set up cameras to catch the mysterious chef, but the footage revealed only empty kitchen space where the meals somehow materialized without any visible preparation process. The food appeared fully cooked and plated, as if delivered by invisible hands. The meals came with handwritten notes in Penelope's own handwriting, describing the recipes and ingredients used. But Penelope had no memory of writing these notes, and the handwriting was perfect, without any of the slight variations that normally occurred when she wrote by hand. The invisible chef began responding to Penelope's specific food cravings. When she thought about wanting a particular dish, it would appear the next morning, prepared exactly as she had imagined it. The chef seemed to have access to her thoughts and desires, creating meals based on her unspoken wishes. But the meals began including ingredients that weren't in Penelope's kitchen. Exotic spices, fresh seafood, rare vegetables that she had never purchased appeared as components of the mysterious meals. The chef was somehow acquiring ingredients from unknown sources and bringing them into her home. The situation escalated when the meals began appearing multiple times per day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks would appear throughout the day, always perfectly timed for when Penelope was feeling hungry. The invisible chef was monitoring her physical needs and responding with supernatural efficiency. The final revelation came when Penelope realized the meals were preparing her for something. Each dish contained specific nutrients and compounds that were gradually changing her physical condition, improving her health, and enhancing her energy levels. The invisible chef wasn't just feeding her, but systematically improving her physical condition for an unknown purpose. Amadeus's Phantom Orchestra. Amadeus Carter heard a full orchestra playing in his living room every night, but his house contained no musical instruments, and he lived in complete isolation. The music was classical, complex, and performed with professional excellence that filled every room of his house. The orchestra played different repertoires each night, performing symphonies, concertos, and chamber pieces with perfect timing and coordination. The music included instruments Amadeus could identify individually, from violins and cellos to woodwinds and percussion, all playing in perfect harmony. Most remarkably, the Phantom Orchestra seemed to respond to Amadeus's musical preferences. When he thought about wanting to hear a particular composer or piece, the orchestra would perform that exact work the same night. The musicians were somehow accessing his thoughts and taking requests from his consciousness. The music began including original compositions that Amadeus had never heard before. The Phantom Orchestra was creating new works, performing premieres of pieces that existed nowhere else. The music was sophisticated and emotionally moving, as if composed by masters who had transcended physical limitations. Amadeus tried to record the performances, but audio equipment captured only silence despite the music being clearly audible to his ears. The Phantom Orchestra existed in a realm that could be heard but not documented, experienced but not proven. The orchestra began performing music that told Amadeus's life story. The compositions reflected his experiences, his emotions, his relationships, translating his personal history into musical narrative. The Phantom musicians were creating biographical symphonies that captured the essence of his existence. When Amadeus tried to conduct the orchestra, waving his arms and directing the tempo, the musicians responded to his gestures perfectly. He could influence their performance, creating a collaborative relationship with invisible artists who followed his artistic vision. The phenomenon reached its climax when the Phantom Orchestra began teaching Amadeus to compose. They would play partial pieces, then pause, waiting for him to imagine the continuation. When he mentally completed the musical phrase, the orchestra would perform his thoughts, helping him develop as a composer through supernatural collaboration. Octavia's Infinite Books. Octavia Reed discovered that her home library contained books about her life written by authors she had never heard of, documenting events that hadn't happened yet. The books appeared overnight, replacing familiar titles with biographical works about her future. Each book covered a different period of Octavia's life, from detailed analyses of her childhood to projected accounts of her old age and death. The writing was literary in quality, treating her life as if it were a fascinating subject worthy of scholarly examination. The future books contained specific details about events, relationships, and decisions that Octavia hadn't yet experienced. They described her future career changes, romantic relationships, family developments, and personal growth with the specificity of historical documents. Most disturbing was that the books contained multiple versions of her future, as if different authors were writing alternate possibilities for her life. Some books described successful outcomes, others detailed failures and tragedies. The library contained every possible future, cataloged and analyzed by unknown writers. When Octavia tried to change her future by making different decisions than those described in the books, new volumes would appear documenting the consequences of her alterations. The library was somehow updating in real time, accounting for her free will while maintaining comprehensive documentation of all possibilities. The books began including commentary and analysis from literary critics discussing Octavia's life as if it were a work of fiction. The critics debated her character development, her thematic significance, her role in larger narratives. Her existence was being treated as literature by scholars in an unknown realm. Octavia found books written from the perspectives of everyone in her life, describing their relationships with her from their viewpoints. She could read what her family members, friends, and colleagues really thought about her, gaining insights into relationships that were both enlightening and devastating. The library's final revelation came when Octavia found a book that explained the phenomenon itself. According to this meta-narrative, her life was being documented by interdimensional scholars who were studying human existence by following individual lives in complete detail. She had been selected as a representative sample of human experience, and her every moment was being recorded for academic purposes in a realm beyond her reality. Sebastian's time loop terror. Sebastian Wright was trapped living the same day repeatedly, but only in his house, while the outside world continued moving forward in normal time. Every time he tried to leave his property, he would find himself back in his bedroom, waking up to experience the identical day again. The time loop was confined to his physical property boundaries. Inside his house and yard, time reset every 24 hours, returning Sebastian to the same morning with all conditions restored to their previous state. But outside his property, the world continued progressing normally, creating a temporal island where he remained trapped. Sebastian could observe the outside world through his windows, watching as days, weeks, and months passed for everyone else while he remained stuck in his recurring Thursday. He watched seasons change, watched his neighbors age, watched the world evolve while he experienced the same conversations, the same meals, the same activities endlessly. The psychological torture of repetition became unbearable. Sebastian knew every word that would be spoken during phone calls, every commercial that would play on television, every sound that would occur throughout the day. The predictability created a form of sensory deprivation despite being surrounded by familiar stimuli. But Sebastian began discovering that small changes were possible within the loop. If he moved objects to different locations, they would remain moved in subsequent cycles. If he broke something, it would remain broken. He could accumulate modifications to his environment across iterations. Using this principle, Sebastian began leaving himself messages, documenting his experiences and theories about the phenomenon. Over hundreds of loops, he accumulated extensive notes about his condition, developing scientific approaches to understanding his temporal imprisonment. The breakthrough came when Sebastian realized the loop had begun on the anniversary of a traumatic event from his past. The repetition was apparently connected to unresolved psychological trauma that had created a metaphysical anchor point in his timeline. Through careful experimentation across thousands of loops, Sebastian discovered that confronting and resolving his past trauma was the key to breaking the temporal prison. The house had become a psychological metaphor made manifest, trapping him until he dealt with issues he had been avoiding. The final loop occurred when Sebastian finally achieved genuine psychological resolution about his past. The next morning, he woke up to a new day, free to leave his property and rejoin the normal flow of time. But the experience had lasted subjective years, aging him mentally while his body remained unchanged, creating a profound disconnect between his psychological and physical age. If these stories made you question every sound in your house, every shadow in your peripheral vision, every moment you spend alone, then you understand why some people never stay home alone again. These TRUE experiences remind us that reality is far stranger and more dangerous than we want to believe. Which story disturbed you the most? Have you experienced anything similar in your own home? Share your own home alone horror stories in the comments below. And remember to like this video if you want more TRUE horror stories that will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about being safe at home. And if you're watching this alone right now, in your own house, with all the lights off, you might want to check that you're actually as alone as you think you are. Subscribe for more TRUE horror stories that prove reality is more terrifying than any fiction.